My point is that the president can exploit the letter of the Constitution, our Constitution, in ways that seriously undermine the spirit of the Constitution, and which therefore can throw our democracy into crisis. Legal scholar Mark Tushnet calls this sort of behavior constitutional hardball, using the letter of the law in a way that eviscerates the spirit of the law. Look at any failing democracy across history and you will find constitutional hardball in abundance. Argentina under Perón, Spain and Germany in the 30s, contemporary Venezuela, Ecuador, Turkey, Hungary, Poland. What historically has prevented our system of checks and balances from devolving into deadlock, into dysfunction, and maybe even into authoritarianism are norms of forbearance. It's a shared understanding among politicians that neither side will deploy its institutional prerogatives to the hilt, that the spirit of the law will prevail over the letter of the law. We argue in the book that norms of mutual toleration and forbearance act as the soft guardrails of democracy. They help to prevent healthy political competition from spiraling into the kind of partisan fight to the death that wrecked democracies in Europe in the 1930s and in Latin America in the 1960s and 70s. Now, American democracy hasn't always had soft guardrails. It wasn't born with soft guardrails. It certainly didn't have them in the 1790s when extreme partisan intolerance and pretty heavy-duty constitutional hardball nearly destroyed the new republic. And of course, we lost our norms of mutual toleration and forbearance in the run-up to the Civil War. And we lost them really for about a generation afterwards. But beginning in the late 19th century, Democrats and Republicans largely accepted one another as legitimate and largely avoided destabilizing acts of constitutional hardball. So there were no impeachments, no successful court packings. Senators were judicious in their use of filibusters, were judicious in their use, in their exercise of their right to advice and constraint. They basically consent, excuse me, basically deferred to the president. And outside of wartime, presidents refrained from acting unilaterally to circumvent Congress. So for more than a century, starting in the late 19th century, our system of checks and balances worked. But again, they worked because they were reinforced by norms of mutual toleration and forbearance. What we argue, and I think we show in the book, is that our country's democratic norms have been unraveling for the last quarter century. We saw early signs of this in the 1990s with the Gingrich-era government shutdowns and the partisan impeachment of Bill Clinton. But the process really took off in the 2000s. When Barack Obama ran for president in 2008, Republicans called him a Marxist, a pro-terrorist, and anti-American. Republican leaders during Obama's presidency, from Giuliani to Huckabee to Gingrich to Palin, said that President Obama did not love America, that Obama and the Democrats were not real Americans. And of course, the birther movement went a step further, questioning Obama's very right to be president. Now, as Daniel pointed out, America has always had an extremist fringe. That is nothing new. What's new is that this was not fringe politics. These were national Republican leaders. This was a vice presidential candidate. Republicans nominated a prominent birther as their presidential candidate in 2016, and they depicted their rival party candidate as a criminal who belonged in jail. So by the 2000s, Republicans had begun to deny the legitimacy of their Democratic rivals. They had begun to cast Democrats as the enemy. The decline of mutual toleration encourages politicians to abandon forbearance. When we view our partisan rivals not as opposition but as enemies, as beyond the pale, when we view them as anti-American, when we view them as a threat to our way of life, we become tempted to use any means necessary to beat them. And that is exactly what's beginning to happen. Politicians are throwing forbearance to the wind. Filibusters are now routine. Politicians shut down the government, refused to raise the debt limit, nearly a few years ago throwing the country into default. We see extraordinary acts of constitutional hardball, like North Carolina's legislative coup of 2016, and perhaps most dramatically of all, the Senate's refusal to allow President Obama to fill a Supreme Court vacancy in 2016. That's an act that was unprecedented since 1866. And all this is before Donald Trump was elected. So the problem is not just that Americans elected a demagogue. It's that we elected a demagogue at a time when the soft guardrails that once protected our system are coming unmoored. So why the hell is this happening? Oh, sorry, I promised that I wouldn't swear and broke it. Won't do it again. We argue that what's primarily driving norm erosion is extreme polarization. Republicans and Democrats have grown so far apart that they now literally fear and loathe one another. In 1960, 5% of Republicans said they would be unhappy if their child married a Democrat. Same thing, basically the same number for Democrats. Today that number is 50%. Last year, a Pew survey found that 49% of Republicans and 55% of Democrats said the other party makes them afraid. We've not seen this level of partisan hatred since the end of Reconstruction. And this is not just traditional liberal-conservative polarization. People do not fear and loathe one another over taxes and health care. They don't. Today's partisan differences run much deeper. They're about race, religion, and way of life. Our parties have changed dramatically during our lifetimes, over the last 50 years. If you go back to the 1960s, 1970s, when many of us were growing up, the two parties were demographically and culturally very similar to one another, almost unmistakable from one another. Both parties were overwhelmingly white and Protestant. The parties differed on taxes, on government spending, on foreign policy, but on fundamental issues of God and race, they were very similar. They were overlapping. Three changes occurred over the last half-century. First of all, the civil rights movement led to a massive migration of Southern whites from the Democrats to the Republicans, and of course, and with the enfranchisement of African Americans at long last in the South, African Americans became overwhelmingly Democrats. Second, the United States experienced a massive wave of immigration. Most of those immigrants and their kids ended up in the Democratic Party. And third, since Reagan, since the early 1980s, evangelical Christians, which were once distributed evenly between the two parties, even a little bit more Democrat than Republican, became overwhelmingly Republican. So by the 2000s, in stark contrast to the 1960s, Democrats and Republicans were demographically and culturally very, very different. The Democrats, of course, are a rainbow coalition of urban secular whites and a diversity of ethnic minorities. The Republicans, by contrast, remain overwhelmingly white and Christian. That's important, because white Christians are not just any group. They were once the majority, a good-sized majority in this country, and even more importantly, they used to sit unchallenged atop this country's social, economic, cultural, and political hierarchies. They filled the presidency, Congress, Supreme Court, governor's mansions. They were pillars of local communities. They were the CEOs. They were the newscasters. They were the movie stars. They were the college professors. And crucially, they were the face of both the Democratic and Republican parties. Those days, of course, are long gone. But losing one's majority and losing one's dominant social status can be deeply, deeply threatening. Many Republican voters, not all of them, many Republican voters feel like the country that they grew up in is being taken away from them. And that, we think, is what ultimately drives polarization in this country. The problem is that extreme polarization can kill democracies. This is a major lesson from the failure of democracy in Europe in the 1930s, in South America in the 1970s. When politics is so deeply polarized that each side views a victory by the other side as intolerable, as beyond the pale, democracy is in real trouble. When an opposition victory is viewed as intolerable, you start to justify using extraordinary means to prevent it. Violence, repression, election fraud, coups. Now, Americans have not reached that point, obviously. But we have reached a point where, according to exit polls in 2016, 1 out of 4 Trump voters believed that he was unfit for the presidency of the United States. He was unfit for office, and yet he was still preferable to a Democrat. We've reached a point where, according to Gallup, Republicans have a much more favorable view of Vladimir Putin than they do Hillary Clinton. Those are dangerous levels of polarization. So Donald Trump is a challenge, but the most fundamental challenge we face today is extreme polarization, driven by a radicalized Republican Party that represents a declining white Christian majority, many of whose members perceive themselves to face an existential threat. Trump is a symptom of that polarization, not a cause of it, and his departure from the presidency is very unlikely to end it. So what can we do in 2 minutes or less? For one, it's absolutely clear that the Republican Party has to change, that it has to become a more diverse party. As long as the GOP represents a white Christian party in a society as diverse as ours, it will always be prone to white nationalist appeals. It will always be prone to white nationalist extremism. But what can Democrats do? There's been a lot of talk, increasing amounts of talk in recent weeks and months in progressive circles about learning how to fight like Republicans. Seriously, if Republicans are going to play constitutional hardball, then Democrats have to play tit for tat. If they don't, they will be victims of an endless series of sucker punches, stolen Supreme Court seats, and the like. And Democrats, in fact, are learning how to fight like Republicans. They just used a filibuster last week to trigger their first major government shutdown. That is a move straight out of the Newt Gingrich playbook. Many Democrats will run this year on a platform of impeachment. That will be the central thing they campaign on. And if Democrats win control of the Senate, there's talk of denying President Trump the ability to fill any Supreme Court vacancy, just like the Republicans did to Obama. We worry a lot about this response. Fighting like Republicans, as legitimate as that is and seems, will inevitably reinforce and even accelerate the process of norm erosion. It will further weaken our country's democratic guardrails. And in our experience studying democracies in crisis in Europe and Latin America and elsewhere, that sort of escalation never ends well. Never ends well. So in our view, opposition to Trump should be loud, it should be vigorous, it should be muscular, but it should be norm-defending rather than norm-breaking. These days, forbearance is often seen, particularly among Democrats, as a sign of weakness, as a sign of sort of backing down or giving in to the other side's bullying. But I want to suggest that in reality, it takes great political courage and strength. Sometimes it means standing up to an angry base and saying you're not going to do what they want, you're going to do what's best for the country and for our country's institutions. Republicans have utterly failed to show that leadership over the last decade or so. Democrats should not follow in their footsteps. Now, I was told I should close with a note of hope, but I'm out of time. What happens now?
Q&A.
Okay.
Questions that you ask at this mic down the virus environment.
Hi.
I have a reaction to 2 points. In terms of the election, 2016, the reason why Trump was nominated is because none of the other candidates were good enough to oppose him. The thing that bothers me the most, that gets very little press as far as the election goes, and you know this statistic, 43% of the electorate stayed home. And this is the most scary thing for me to realize, because this is not democracy if people are going to stay home. Bernie Sanders should have been the candidate. Hillary Clinton, the queen of, the Democratic Party, sort of boxed him out, and the Bernie people stayed home. So this is that point. I just have one comment as far as packing the courts. My hero and many of my parents' friends and family's hero, FDR, tried to pack the courts too, as you probably know. And for some reason it didn't work, but maybe you could comment on why. But he tried. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, good question. So, I mean, I'd sort of take the first point to be about voter turnout at some level. Why is voter turnout low, and what can be done about this? And, it's a very complicated question. There's lots of things at work. And it's, in some ways, it's easy to blame citizens for not turning out. But one way I think about this that maybe is a little different is that in many ways, the parties mobilize voters to turn out. And parties mobilize voters to turn out, not individually. No, individual voters aren't contacted. Usually, the way historically this has happened is voters are members of groups and organizations, civil society institutions, labor unions for the left, for instance. And as civil society institutions have transformed and as labor unions have weakened, it's harder for parties to reach and to mobilize voters. And so one kind of transformation that, and actually there's recent political science, I just read a recent paper which research that shows in states that have laws that restrict the ability of unions to organize, there's lower voter turnout, and this has negative consequences. So I think in a way the kind of transformation of our economy, so I'm getting into the complex part of the answer, the transformation of the economy, the weakening of labor unions means that parties need to find new parties to mobilize. And parties need to come up with new techniques of organization as well as dealing with the rise of new types of media. So in some ways I think the problem of turnout is in part an organization and a technological challenge. And so parties need to develop new ways of reaching voters. On the second point about court packing, yeah, so that's a story we tell in the book. It's a fascinating and revealing story of Roosevelt, after winning re-election in '36, decided his New Deal agenda was stalling out, and all the members of the Supreme Court had received their legal educations in the 19th century. These were these old-fashioned guys, and he wanted to get and they were blocking his agenda, so he wanted to expand the size of the court, and he pushed for this. And it was interesting doing research on this because as we did it, I really had the feeling, had I been alive at that time, I may have been cheering him on. But the other part of me realized also that this is dangerous. This is exactly the kind of thing that we're talking about, where institutions are politicized. And had he been successful, who knows what, the Supreme Court would be constantly changing its number. And so he was defeated. How was he defeated, though? This is the interesting point. He was defeated not only by Republicans, but by members of the Democratic Party. There were conservative Democrats as well as New Deal allies who thought this was too far. And there was one incredible story of a senator from Wyoming who was such a close partner and friend of the Roosevelts that at the inauguration dinner, he sat next to Eleanor Roosevelt and 4 weeks later came out publicly against this and viewed this as an attack on democratic institutions and came out against this. So this was a case of party allies saying the institutions are more important than our agenda.
And so another case of that is Nixon. Nixon, it took a while, but Nixon ultimately is defeated by defection of key members of his own party. It was not just Democrats at the end of the day who stopped Nixon, it was Democrats and Republicans. The question is, today, if there's a similar abuse, an abuse comparable to FDR's court packing, to Nixon's many criminal acts, would Republicans cross the aisle and stand up to Trump? And I think so far the evidence is probably not. Sure.
Excuse me. I was impressed by your analysis, all of it, and yet it focused on polarization and forbearance, it seemed to me. I was really surprised that you didn't mention what I see as sort of the 800-pound gorilla, which is Roger Ailes, Fox News, and disinformation on the internet. In a time when if polarization is so much what is going to kill us, we can't get people to agree that water is wet. They live in alternate universes, and I don't see. Again, I'm out of time, but lack of hope. I mean, I don't see what's going to change that dynamic. So, if you could.
Yeah. So there is clear evidence that that the rise, one of social media and also of hyper-partisan media, is pushing public opinion to the extremes. So there is evidence that is at work. Our view is that that's a secondary cause, that the underlying cause of our polarization, the underlying source of our polarization is the partisan racial and cultural sorting that I described. That Fox News is exacerbating this problem, but take it away and we would still have a deeply polarized society.
I also was very impressed with all the analyses, and especially the parties as gatekeepers. And having this kind of for-the-country exchange is getting harder and harder to the polarization. I was also, my ears perked up when, Dan, you talked about we need a reorganization internally to both parties, but especially, I think, to the Democratic Party, because of Hillary Clinton locked in, the Democrats locked her in right away, and there was some sort of what you call invisible primary there that dominated throughout that go for the presidency. And when I was so shocked at 2 a.m. when, Wisconsin was won, I was shocked like everybody else, but then I said, did Hillary Clinton give us Trump? And that, I'd like some comments on that. That's too much of a reduction. But it keys in, I think, to what you're talking about regarding a real need for a deep reorganization. Both Stephen and Dan, please.
Yeah, I guess I understand the point. And there's, some people maybe didn't like Hillary, and there's, maybe reasons to think she wasn't the best candidate. But there's a difference between having a mediocre candidate and a candidate who's a threat to democracy. And so I think the most we can hope, the most we can hope for from parties is that they deliver, at the very least, mediocre candidates. Okay? And, so at some level, I think that maybe there was the process of selecting Hillary, was not the process that's not the outcome that people wanted. But had she become president, we'd be in a different situation than we are now. So I think, from my view, the real core of the problem is to think about how did a demagogic figure get through this obstacle course, and that's at the end of the day is the biggest threat to our democracy. We can debate about policy differences between the left side of the Democratic Party, the right side of the Democratic Party, or even between somebody like Mitt Romney and the Democratic Party. But these are policy debates. These are the kinds of debates we should be having. We shouldn't be having debates about, is this person a threat to democracy? So that's why at the end of the day, if I have to choose, it's a balancing act. If you want gatekeeping, but this may also, generate candidates that people don't like. But that, in some ways, that's part of the democratic game.